The conviction of Lucy Letby was a perfect storm of ineptitude. Lucy Letby was accused of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 more and was ultimately found guilty and convicted and sentenced to 15 whole life sentences, meaning she will die in prison unless she is exonerated, which she will be. But here is the perfect storm that surrounded Lucy's case, and it is extensive. And I'll do my best to remain partial and measured and not become emotional, but that's hard for me to do in this case because it's close to my heart, because she's an innocent woman who is in prison for something she didn't do. So, the first part of the perfect storm of Lucy Letby's case, the failing ward on which she worked. It was failing to such an extent that the head consultant, who ultimately became one of her accusers, started a campaign to raise money to expand the unit because it was too small to, number one, house the equipment necessary to properly care for neonatal infants, and also because the cots were too close together and that increased the likelihood of infection. There was a drainage problem on the unit, meaning that sewage was backing up into the toilets and the sinks and leaking from the ceilings in the babies' rooms. So much so that the same consultant put diapers on the ceiling to catch the feces so that it wouldn't land on the infants. But that doesn't work. The bacteria is still in the air. It's still going to make the baby sick, and it created a problem with pneumonia and sepsis and ultimate death of these babies. Lucy Letby saw that these issues were occurring and started taking notes on a system called Datex, which gives information about each shift and about the problems on each shift so that the hospital management can look back and see ways to improve the unit. She knew that there was a major problem and that disaster was coming. And so she was hoping to either fix the problems on the unit or lower the acuity of patients accepted onto the unit so that they could care, so that they could better care for the number of infants they had rather than increasing that number. Those things didn't happen. What happened instead was that the doctors on her unit became very angry, particularly 2 of them, and they began a multi-year campaign accusing her of being guilty of murdering babies when in fact the problem was the unit itself and the ineptitude of the doctors. Another part of the perfect storm of this case was the bumbling police force that was in charge of investigating it. They could not follow the intricacies involved in the many circumstances that always surround the deaths of neonatal babies. That's number one. And so rather than conducting a proper investigation where they look at the hospital, the unit, the doctors, all the nurses, including Lucy Letby, they believed what these doctors said immediately, even though initially they claimed nothing had happened when the hospital came to them asking them to investigate whether malfeasance had occurred. When the doctors came to meet with them, they suddenly changed their tune and decided Lucy Letby was a serial killer and built a case around that. They'll claim otherwise, but if you look at their records and you look at their emails and you look at their interviews and you look at their meetings, you see that they immediately decided after meeting with those doctors for an hour that Lucy Letby was a serial killer, and they built a case around it. They didn't have the capability to run a real investigation. So they made it simple for themselves. They figured they'd be big heroes, get rid of the serial killer on the unit, and they got emotional. And they decided to believe a thing that wasn't true because it was easier and it made them look good. That's part of the perfect storm. And then the next, and perhaps largest part of this perfect storm was the medical expert that was brought in the examination of the case and then in the court case as well, a conflict of interest at best. This medical expert had worked on many cases and caused havoc on many cases and in many women's lives, particularly in the family court, who saw this case in the newspaper and contacted the Chester police through his agency that got him onto court cases, got an interview with the cops, and was immediately brought on because he could speak the game, he could talk the game, and they believed him because they couldn't handle it. He was a smooth operator, and they believed him because he stood to build his reputation as the hero he believed himself to be, and because he stood to gain 500,000 pounds, which is ultimately what he made on the case. After years of reports and testimony, he made a lot of money. And he noted after the conviction that he did this kind of work to keep his daughter in horses and his son in cars. This is the person we're dealing with. He built his case around flawed evidence. It's all since been contested by real experts. Here are some of the modes of murder that he accused Lucy Letby of using in the court case. He accused her of dislodging breathing tubes and claimed that that never happens, that neonatal infants never have their breathing tubes dislodged. It's just so uncommon. It has to be done by somebody. But the fact is, according to many medical experts since her conviction, that these breathing tubes become dislodged regularly because they're small. And so even a slight movement of the head on the part of the neonate will dislodge the breathing tube. So it's not unusual for breathing tubes to become dislodged. But Evans, Dowie Evans, the medical expert, accused Lucy Letby of doing it on purpose. And he used the testimony of one of the doctors who was accusing her, who claimed that he had a gut feeling that something was going wrong. And he walked in on her standing over an infant whose breathing tube had been dislodged, and she wasn't doing anything about it. He said she didn't call for help. She didn't do anything about it. And yet later, an email emerged that he wrote a year before that said that she did call for help. So he lied on the stand and should be held accountable for perjury. But all of that aside, all of that being untrue, one other thing that came out from medical experts, including nurses who work on neonatal units, nurses like Michelle Warden, have said that when a breathing tube in a neonatal infant becomes dislodged, nurses take the opportunity to watch to see how the baby adjusts to not having the tube because it's pretty much the only opportunity where they have to do that. They can't just reach in and dislodge tubes because infection can ensue. So if the tube becomes dislodged accidentally, it's a good chance to see how they handle air on their own. So if Lucy Letby had been seen standing over an infant with a dislodged breathing tube, it would have been normal for her to watch for a moment rather than reach right in. So that's just to say, but it didn't even happen in the first place. So we can discount that anyway. Dowie Evans also claimed that Lucy Letby murdered babies through air embolism by injecting air into their venous air tubes. But unfortunately, the research he used was based on arterial air embolism, not venous air embolism. So all of the signs, all of the proof he used to accuse Lucy Letby of air embolism were discounted. So that's a foolish notion based on bad reading. And she was accused of murder via air embolism on many counts, all of which have been disproven as even being possible. He accused Lucy Letby of punching babies so hard that it had the force of a car accident because he saw a damaged liver in a scan in one of the records that he saw. But what he didn't note and was in the records was that on the day he accused Lucy Letby of punching the baby had collapsed and had to be resuscitated. And the doctor who was resuscitating the baby poked a needle into the baby's abdomen, which is a procedure that is done to release gas and help with breathing. But unfortunately, the doctor poked the baby on the wrong side of the abdomen and so poked the liver and did damage to the liver. So it had nothing to do with Lucy Letby punching a baby. It had to do with a doctor incompetently resuscitating a baby. And I say this with compassion. I'm not a doctor. I could never do what a doctor does. But it's still a fact that Lucy Letby did not damage the baby's liver. The doctor did. He also accused Lucy Letby of overfeeding, which is a ridiculous notion because the amount of time it would take to overfeed a baby and the vomiting that would ensue is impossible in the tininess of the ward she worked on and in the time she had. It just isn't possible, but that was used as a method of murder. And he also accused her of pushing air into the baby's stomachs, which just wouldn't do anything at all. Medical experts since have said that that's just not a mode of murder at all. It wouldn't kill anybody, an adult or a neonate. It just isn't reasonable. Another aspect of the perfect storm of the Lucy Letby case was the prosecution, who did not allow pertinent information into the court, namely a grievance that Lucy Letby filed against the doctors accusing her of murder, and a grievance that was won by her, and which led to the doctors being forced to apologize to her for bullying her. That was not allowed into the courtroom. The jury didn't see that. They didn't see that Lucy Letby had indeed been found innocent by the hospital, who investigated the entire thing and determined that she had done nothing wrong. That wasn't shown to the jury. They didn't know that. This prosecutor cared not about truth. He cared about winning, which I presume is his job. But if that's his job, it's a problem. because it put one woman and many other people in prison for something they did not do. Unsafe convictions based on prosecutors who want to win above all else. A major problem and a part of the perfect storm. Another part of the perfect storm was a judge who was tired, and by the way, retired a year after the case. I guess this was his swan song. He was taken in by the medical expert because he didn't know what was being said. This judge could barely follow what was being said. And in fact, in his summing up, he had to be corrected many times about many pertinent points in terms of the evidence because he couldn't understand it, like most people couldn't understand it because it was foolishness. But still, he was the judge. He was taken in by it. He was taken in by the prosecution. He disallowed a lot of information that would have led to a fairer trial, including that grievance, and also allowed statistical evidence that just made no sense at all. Lord Justice Jackson wrote a letter to Goss about a quarter of the way through the trial, letting Goss know that Dowie Evans, the medical expert, was not a valid witness, that he was biased, that his evidence was terrible, that he should be removed from the case and another witness should be placed or no witness at all because he wasn't worthy of the court. Justice Goss ignored that. He also allowed the jury to find Lucy Letby guilty even though they didn't have a mode of murder. He pronounced that even though you don't know how she killed the baby, you can find her guilty if you think she's guilty. He made that possible. And that leads to the next aspect of this perfect storm of a case, the jury. They were ill-equipped to hear this testimony. Most people would be, I would be. 10 months of mind-numbing medical testimony that makes no sense. They probably zoned out most of the time. They probably didn't hear most of it. They were manipulated with emotion and then forced to sit through medical testimony that made no sense to them. The faulty statistics were a major part of the case. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy revolves around the idea of somebody shooting the side of a barn and trying to make it seem as though they hit a perfect target. And so they shoot and shoot and shoot. And then they draw a circle around the most groupings of bullet holes so that it can seem as though they hit a target. That's what happened with Lucy Letby's statistics. A chart was made of all of the times that she was on duty and infants died, but it was worked around and it was manipulated so that it looked like she was present for many of the deaths. But if they had chosen another nurse to do this with, they would have found the same thing. It wasn't legitimate. It was completely illegitimate. And professional statisticians have come out since and disclaimed all of what was used. But unfortunately, the prosecutor would show the jury this chart of X's that made it look like Lucy Letby was present for all of the murders, even though she wasn't for a lot of them. And it manipulated the juries to believe that she had murdered these babies, when in fact what they were looking at was completely faulty and not legitimate at all. One juror was heard within days of the trial starting to say that they believed she was guilty already. They didn't need to hear more. It was the opening arguments, and this juror said that, and Judge Goss, the judge, allowed this juror to stay on the jury. And then last but not least, the perfect storm was the media and the mass hysteria and frankly social madness that ensued around the police putting these articles in the paper about a nurse being accused of murdering babies. Hysteria ensued. A witch hunt ensued. There was no non-biased reporting. The journalism was terrible, claiming that Lucy Letby was this and Lucy Letby was that, a monster, an angel of death, the worst serial killer of children in Britain's history. All of this led to a mass hysteria that I was a part of in another country. I believed it. I was disgusted by the whole thing, totally believed it. And only until I learned the facts behind the case, only until I took the time to investigate and see, was I shown that my hysteria was not valid, that it was a sad remnant of my relation to chimps, my need to point out one individual and attack them in order to feel safe, in order to feel protected, in order to feel like I was a part of the campfire circle. Not conscious, unconscious, but there nonetheless. So, what can we learn from all of this? Number one, medical and legal institutions need an overhaul in the Western world, not just England. An example in the US, the case of Dennis DeShane, found guilty of murdering a 12-year-old girl in the 80s. And since all of the DNA evidence toward that case has been disproven, and yet he remains in jail for the rest of his life for a murder he didn't commit. It happens in the US too. It's not just England. Health systems are a disaster, as we all know. These systems need to be overhauled, looked at, fixed, reconfigured. Medical experts in the UK need much more vetting and scrutiny. Medical cases such as this need a panel of experts to remain present throughout, to lead and guide the journey, the jury, the lawyers, and the judge. Entirely necessary for these kinds of cases in every part of the world. Unfairly weighted prosecution versus defense. Lucy's defense team was hobbled from the beginning by time. They had way less time. That's always an issue for defense teams. But they also didn't have the money that the prosecution had. They were hobbled by the judge's decisions. Expert witnesses were not called on Lucy's behalf for reasons that nobody really knows, but I presume have to do with decisions made by the judge that skewed the scale of justice toward prosecution. And then, most importantly, humanity's willingness to attack before compassionate consideration needs to be looked at. We have a choice to breathe and be rational, to consider the facts as we have them and decide if they warrant more consideration rather than just jump to what we're told, to be discerning in these kinds of situations, to not have knee-jerk reactions to things, both cases like this and in our lives, to breathe and not jump to impulse and instinct. Lucy Letby is an innocent woman. Be on the right side of history. Push for her exoneration because it's coming. She will be exonerated. She is innocent. And this perfect storm that led to her conviction is a really good example of the ways in which humanity needs to expand, work on itself, grow, and have compassion in times of struggle.